April 11th, 1951. Tokyo, Japan, 1 a.m. General Douglas MacArthur is asleep in the American embassy. He's been Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Far East for nearly 6 years. He ruled Japan after World War II, rebuilt the country, wrote its constitution. He's 71 years old, 5 stars on his uniform, one of the most famous military leaders in the world. He expects to retire from Tokyo when he's ready, on his own terms, with full ceremony and honor. An aide wakes him with urgent news. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune has just called, asking for comment. Comment on what? On being relieved of command? MacArthur is confused. What is the reporter talking about? He hasn't been relieved of command. There must be some mistake. But there's no mistake. Colonel Sidney Huff, MacArthur's closest aide, turns on the radio. Commercial radio stations are broadcasting the news. President Truman has fired General Douglas MacArthur. He's been relieved of all commands. General Matthew Ridgway will replace him. MacArthur sits in stunned silence. He's learning that he's been fired by listening to a radio broadcast. The President of the United States has dismissed him without warning, without personal notification, without even the courtesy of a phone call or private message. After 52 years of military service, after leading Allied forces to victory in the Pacific, after being one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, Douglas MacArthur is finding out he's been fired from a news announcer. MacArthur turns to his wife, Jean, and says just 5 words. "Jeannie, we're going home at last." That's it. No rage, no cursing, no breakdown. Just those 5 quiet words. Then MacArthur goes back to bed. He doesn't call Washington. He doesn't issue a statement. He doesn't even stay up to hear more news. He simply goes back to sleep. This is not the reaction anyone expected. MacArthur is famous for his ego, his dramatic speeches, his theatrical personality. People expect him to explode with fury, to denounce Truman, to fight back immediately. Instead, he says 5 calm words and goes to sleep. But over the next few weeks, MacArthur will have plenty to say. He'll return to America as a conquering hero. He'll give the most emotional speech of his life to Congress. He'll go on a speaking tour that draws millions of people. And everything he says will shake American politics to its core. This is the story of what MacArthur said when Truman fired him. Not just in that first moment, but in the days and weeks that followed. It's about a general's response to the greatest humiliation of his career, a speech that made grown men cry, and words that almost brought down a presidency. Let's go back to understand why this moment happened and what it meant. By April 1951, the relationship between President Truman and General MacArthur had completely broken down. They disagreed fundamentally about how to fight the Korean War. Truman wanted to keep the war limited, avoid expanding it into China, and prevent World War III with the Soviet Union. MacArthur wanted to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, and use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to open a second front. He possibly even wanted to use atomic bombs. For months, MacArthur had been publicly contradicting presidential policy. He gave interviews criticizing Truman's strategy. He sent letters to Republican congressmen attacking the administration. In March 1951, he issued a public statement that sabotaged Truman's planned peace initiative. He was openly defying his commander-in-chief. Truman had finally had enough. On April 9th, he met with his top advisors. They all agreed MacArthur had to go. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all military men, agreed that MacArthur's insubordination couldn't continue. On April 10th, Truman made his decision. MacArthur would be relieved of command. The plan was to have Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who was in Korea, personally deliver the dismissal notice to MacArthur in Tokyo. But communication problems delayed this. Meanwhile, word was leaking in Washington. Reporters were asking questions. Truman worried the story would break before MacArthur was officially notified. At 1 a.m. Washington time on April 11th, which was 1 a.m. April 12th in Tokyo, Truman authorized releasing the news to the press. The official orders were sent to MacArthur by commercial telegram, but they arrived after the news had already been broadcast. So MacArthur learned he was fired from a reporter's phone call and a radio broadcast. It was a humiliating way to be dismissed, and Truman later admitted it was handled badly. But the decision was made, and there was no taking it back. When MacArthur woke up that morning after his brief sleep, he faced the question of how to respond. He could denounce Truman. He could claim the dismissal was illegal. He could refuse to obey and force Truman to remove him physically. He could resign in protest rather than accept being fired. MacArthur did none of these things. His first official statement was brief and dignified. "I have just received your message relieving me of my commands. I comply at once." That was it. 12 words. No argument, no protest, no attempt to fight the decision. MacArthur accepted the dismissal immediately and completely. This shocked people who knew MacArthur. He was not known for accepting defeat gracefully. He was famous for his massive ego and his conviction that he was always right. Many expected him to rage against the decision, to claim it was a political betrayal, to fight back. But MacArthur understood something important. If he accepted the dismissal with dignity, he would maintain the moral high ground. The story would become about Truman firing a great general, not about MacArthur refusing to obey orders. By complying immediately and quietly, MacArthur made himself look like the victim of political persecution rather than a general who had disobeyed his commander-in-chief. Over the next few days, MacArthur prepared to leave Tokyo. He'd lived there for nearly 6 years. He'd become almost a king in Japan, wielding more power than any American general had ever held in peacetime. Now he was leaving in disgrace, fired by a president whose approval rating was half of his own. But something unexpected was happening in America. The public reaction to MacArthur's firing was explosive. Millions of Americans were outraged. They saw Truman as a failed president firing a war hero. They saw it as political manipulation, as appeasement of communism, as betrayal. Republican politicians immediately attacked Truman. Senator Joseph McCarthy said Truman must have made the decision while drunk. Senator Richard Nixon called for Truman's impeachment. Senator Robert Taft suggested the dismissal was ordered by European allies who wanted to appease communism. State legislatures passed resolutions condemning Truman. In California, flags flew at half-mast as if someone had died. Truman's approval rating, already low, dropped to 26%. It was one of the lowest approval ratings ever recorded for a president. The public had turned decisively against Truman. Meanwhile, MacArthur was becoming a martyr. The general who had been fired was now being elevated to heroic status. Cities were already planning parades. Congress was preparing to invite him to address a joint session. MacArthur was going to return to America as a conquering hero, and everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. MacArthur left Tokyo on April 16, 1951. Thousands of Japanese lined the streets to say goodbye. Many were crying. MacArthur had been their ruler for 6 years, and many Japanese admired him despite the fact that he'd conquered their country. His departure was treated almost like the end of an era. MacArthur's plane flew to Hawaii, then to San Francisco. At every stop, enormous crowds gathered. In San Francisco, over 500,000 people lined the streets for his motorcade. It was the largest crowd in San Francisco history. People held signs saying, "Welcome home," and "God bless MacArthur." Some signs said, "Impeach Truman." But MacArthur still hadn't given a major speech. He'd issued brief statements thanking people for their support, but he hadn't explained his side of the story. He hadn't attacked Truman directly. He was building anticipation, letting public sympathy grow, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came on April 19, 1951, when MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress. It would be one of the most famous speeches in American history. The House chamber was packed. every senator and representative was there. The Supreme Court justices were there. The cabinet was there, except for Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall, who pointedly refused to attend. Millions more listened on radio or watched on television. MacArthur entered the chamber to thunderous applause. He walked slowly to the podium, his face serious, his bearing dignified. He looked every inch the great general, despite being out of uniform for the first time in decades. Then MacArthur spoke. For 37 minutes, he defended his conduct in Korea, explained his strategy, and criticized the Truman administration's approach to the war without directly attacking Truman personally. He talked about the nature of war. In war, there is no substitute for victory. This phrase would become MacArthur's most famous line, a direct repudiation of Truman's limited war strategy. He explained his belief that the war should be expanded. Why, my soldiers asked of me, surrender military advantages to an enemy in the field, I could not answer. He defended his record. I have been severely criticized for my handling of the Korean War. I can only say that I did what I thought was right. And then, at the end, MacArthur delivered the emotional climax of the speech. He talked about his 52 years of military service from West Point to the battlefields of 2 world wars. He talked about growing old and approaching the end of his career. And then he said the words that would be remembered forever. I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. The chamber erupted. Congressmen were crying. Hardened politicians had tears streaming down their faces. The applause went on for minutes. People were standing, cheering, overwhelmed with emotion. Representative Dewey Short of Missouri later said, "We saw a great hunk of God in the flesh, and we heard the voice of God." It was theater. It was manipulation. It was one of the greatest performances in American political history. MacArthur had taken his dismissal and turned it into martyrdom. He'd made himself the victim and Truman the villain, and he'd done it without directly attacking the president, which would have seemed petty and vindictive. The line about the old soldier who would just fade away was borrowed from an old military ballad. It wasn't original to MacArthur, but the way he delivered it, with perfect timing and emotion, made it seem like a spontaneous, heartfelt farewell. People believed they were witnessing the end of a great man's career, a warrior laying down his sword after a lifetime of service. But MacArthur had no intention of fading away. Over the next few weeks, he went on a speaking tour. He gave speeches in multiple cities. He attended parades in New York, Chicago, and other major cities. The New York parade drew 7.5 million people, more people than in any parade in history. More people came out to see MacArthur than had come out for Eisenhower after World War II. In his speeches, MacArthur continued to defend his position on Korea. He argued that the war could have been won if his strategy had been followed. He said the Truman administration was afraid to confront communism directly. He suggested that political considerations were overriding military judgment. But MacArthur was careful. He never directly called Truman a coward or a communist sympathizer. He never accused Truman of deliberately trying to lose the war. He stayed just on the right side of propriety, making his criticisms indirect and allowing his supporters to fill in the harsher accusations themselves. For a few months, it seemed like MacArthur might ride this wave of public support to something bigger. There was talk of him running for president in 1952. Some Republicans wanted to draft him as their nominee. At 71, he'd be old, but so what? He was Douglas MacArthur. His popularity was enormous. But then something interesting happened. As MacArthur kept speaking, his message started to wear thin. People began to actually think about what he was proposing. Expanding the war with China, possibly using nuclear weapons, risking World War III. As the emotion faded, the logic started to seem dangerous. Meanwhile, the Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings on MacArthur's dismissal. They called MacArthur to testify. He spoke for 3 days, explaining his strategy and defending his actions. Then they called Truman's advisors and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The testimony from the Joint Chiefs was devastating for MacArthur. One after another, America's top military leaders testified that they had supported Truman's decision to fire MacArthur. They said MacArthur's strategy was too risky. They said expanding the war into China was dangerous and unnecessary. They said MacArthur had repeatedly ignored orders and exceeded his authority. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, gave particularly damaging testimony. He said MacArthur's strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. This phrase perfectly captured why Truman had fired MacArthur, not because MacArthur was wrong about everything, but because his focus on Asia distracted from the more important threat in Europe. As the hearings continued through the summer of 1951, public opinion slowly shifted. People began to understand that Truman had fired MacArthur not out of cowardice or political expediency, but because MacArthur had been insubordinate and his strategy was genuinely dangerous. MacArthur's popularity began to fade. The talk of running for president evaporated. By the time the Republican convention met in 1952, MacArthur was barely mentioned. The nomination went to Eisenhower, not MacArthur. MacArthur did speak at the Republican convention, giving the keynote address, but it was a disaster. He spoke for too long, his rhetoric was too grandiose, and the delegates were impatient to get to the real business of nominating Eisenhower. MacArthur's speech was seen as a sad reminder of a man whose moment had passed. After 1952, MacArthur largely did fade away, just as he'd promised. He took a job as chairman of the board of Remington Rand Corporation. He wrote his memoirs, he gave occasional speeches, but he was no longer a force in American politics or military affairs. Looking back, what MacArthur said when Truman fired him was less important than how he said it. His initial response, "Jeannie, we're going home at last," was perfect. It made him seem resigned, almost relieved, ready to return to America after years abroad. His official compliance, "I comply at once," was equally perfect. It made him look like a dutiful soldier accepting orders, even unjust ones. And his speech to Congress, especially the old soldier ending, was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It turned his firing into a tragic farewell, himself into a martyred hero, and Truman into a villain. For a few months, it worked. MacArthur's words resonated with millions of Americans who were frustrated with the Korean War, distrustful of Truman, and nostalgic for the clear victories of World War II. But ultimately, what MacArthur said couldn't overcome what MacArthur had done. He'd defied presidential authority. He'd publicly contradicted his commander-in-chief. He'd placed his military judgment above civilian control. And in America, that's not acceptable, no matter how many stars you have or how many battles you've won. What MacArthur said when Truman fired him was, "I comply at once." What he should have said months earlier was, "I obey my orders even when I disagree with them." If he'd said that, he might have finished his career with honor, instead of being fired and spending his final years as a footnote to history. The old soldier did fade away, eventually, but not before showing America that even the greatest generals must answer to civilian authority. That was the real lesson of what MacArthur said when Truman fired him. Compliance came too late to save his career, but just in time to save the principle that in America, the president commands and generals obey. This video presents historical events based on documented records, including MacArthur's statements, congressional testimony, contemporary news accounts, and scholarly research. Historical interpretations may vary among historians and scholars. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources when studying this period of American history. This content is intended for educational purposes.